Before his death, Nobel Prize winner Mikhail Gorbachev confronted a question that had followed him for decades: why the Soviet Union truly collapsed. The admission did not come through an interview or a public statement. It emerged quietly, when the last leader of the USSR reflected on the empire he once believed could be saved. What he acknowledged challenged decades of speculation and stripped away the simplified explanations that had long dominated public memory. For years, the collapse of the Soviet Union was explained through familiar causes: economic stagnation, nationalist pressure, political infighting. Gorbachev himself repeated these explanations many times, yet near the end of his life, he admitted that none of them captured the deeper truth. The answer he arrived at was not strategic or ideological, it was personal. He believed the real cause was far more complex and far more human. The question he avoided for decades. In the final years of his life, Gorbachev, physically weakened but mentally sharp, sat in the quiet of his home outside Moscow and addressed the question he had carefully sidestepped for more than 30 years. Why did the Soviet Union really collapse? This time, he did not speak as a politician defending his legacy. He spoke as a man trying to understand it. For decades, he had offered measured explanations: economic inefficiency, nationalist movements, institutional rigidity, political resistance. Each explanation contained truth, but none told the whole story. What he reached in his later years was not an analysis, but a confession. He had come to believe that the collapse was not simply the failure of a system, but the exposure of something fundamentally broken in the way power, fear, and silence had shaped Soviet society.
Inheriting an empire already in decay. When Gorbachev assumed leadership in 1985, the Soviet Union still appeared formidable. Its military power was immense, its institutions looked permanent, and its global influence remained intact. Yet beneath that image, the system was already failing. In later reflections, Gorbachev compared the Soviet state to a massive machine kept running long after its purpose had been lost. Factories fulfilled quotas without producing value. Agriculture failed despite vast resources. Ministries survived by concealing reality, protecting careers through silence rather than truth. He described his inheritance as stepping into a structure that looked stable from the outside, while its foundation quietly collapsed underneath. What made his position tragic was not that he wanted to dismantle the system. He didn't. He believed it could be repaired. In his early months, he traveled across the republics and listened as ordinary citizens spoke openly about shortages, corruption, and fear. Many believed reform was finally possible, and Gorbachev believed them too.
Only years later did he admit what he had failed to see at the time: the decay ran deeper than reform could reach. Transparency did not strengthen the system, it strained it. Honesty became unbearable pressure on institutions built to survive through concealment. That honesty became glasnost, that strain became perestroika, and what emerged was not renewal, but collapse. In his view, the reforms did not destroy the Soviet Union, they revealed that it had already been beyond saving. Chernobyl and the collapse of credibility. Among all the crises Gorbachev faced, none affected him as deeply as Chernobyl. Long after the Soviet Union dissolved, it remained the event he returned to in private reflection. In his later years, he acknowledged that Chernobyl was not just a nuclear disaster, it was the moment the Soviet system exposed itself. What devastated him most was not the explosion itself, but the response. Secrecy, denial, and the suppression of scientific warnings followed instinctively. Officials feared public panic more than public safety, allowing exposure to spread while the truth was withheld. In Gorbachev's view, the disaster forced a government built on controlled information to confront a reality it could no longer conceal. He later described the days after the explosion as a mirror held up to the state. Citizens saw hesitation instead of authority, silence instead of protection. When radioactive clouds drifted across Ukraine and beyond, the image of control collapsed. For the first time, people questioned not a single decision, but the legitimacy of a system that hid danger from its own population. In his final years, Gorbachev admitted that Chernobyl shattered the country's confidence in itself. It was a psychological rupture as much as a political one. The disaster raised a question that could not be contained. If the state lied about this, what else had it hidden? Chernobyl directly shaped his embrace of glasnost. Years later, he reflected that the disaster opened the door, and transparency forced him to let light into a system built to block it. What the light revealed was not one failure, but a culture of concealment embedded deep within Soviet governance. He came to believe that Chernobyl did not cause the collapse, but it revealed how fragile the system already was. The Soviet Union, he concluded, was capable of surviving mistakes, but not capable of surviving truth once it escaped control. Reforms that unleashed forces he couldn't contain. When Gorbachev introduced glasnost and perestroika, his goal was renewal, not dissolution. He envisioned a Soviet Union that preserved its core principles while correcting corruption, inefficiency, and stagnation through openness and reform. He believed transparency would strengthen legitimacy, not undermine it. Internationally, his vision was celebrated. Western leaders saw him as a rare figure willing to negotiate rather than intimidate. At home, however, the reaction was divided. The entrenched political elite viewed openness as destabilizing, a threat to the mechanisms that had preserved their authority for decades. For ordinary citizens, glasnost was transformative. Censored histories resurfaced, government failures were discussed openly, corruption, once whispered about, became public knowledge. What followed was not measured reform, but an explosion of suppressed grievances released all at once. Gorbachev later acknowledged that the scale of this reaction surprised him. He had believed truth would correct the system. Instead, it reshaped how people understood themselves, their history, and their identity. Once citizens realized how much had been hidden, they no longer asked for small changes, they demanded fundamental transformation. Nowhere was this more evident than in the republics. Glasnost allowed long-suppressed national identities to reemerge. Languages, histories, and political aspirations resurfaced with force. Nationalism, once restrained by coercion, gained legitimacy through public support. In hindsight, Gorbachev concluded that openness did not fracture unity. It revealed that unity had never truly existed. His reforms did not break the Union. They exposed a reality that had been held together by silence. Until the end, he maintained that reform was necessary, but he acknowledged that it accelerated an inevitable process. In freeing speech, he freed nations, and in doing so, made dissolution unavoidable. The coup that ended any chance of survival. In Gorbachev's view, the final blow came in August 1991. The failed coup attempt by hardline officials destroyed the last possibility of preserving the Union through peaceful reform. Even in his final years, he described it as the moment collapse became irreversible. In the days leading up to the coup, he had been finalizing a new Union treaty, one designed to grant greater autonomy to the republics while maintaining a federated structure. He believed it was the only viable path forward. But for the old guard, any redistribution of power was unacceptable. They feared democracy, feared reform, and feared the loss of control. The coup was poorly executed, but its consequences were devastating. Cut off at his dacha in Crimea, isolated from communication and uncertain of his fate, Gorbachev later admitted the coup accomplished something even more damaging than its planners intended. It shattered public trust in the central government. From that moment on, the Soviet Union existed in name only. Betrayal at the top. Although Gorbachev rarely displayed public resentment, he carried a lasting sense of betrayal, particularly toward Boris Yeltsin. In later interviews, he accused Yeltsin of dismantling the Union, not out of necessity, but ambition. The signing of the Belovezha Accords, which formally dissolved the Soviet Union without Gorbachev's participation, remained one of his deepest grievances. He described it as a political ambush, an abrupt decision made by a small group of leaders acting in their own interests rather than the country's. In one of his most candid moments, Gorbachev admitted that while he had expected resistance, he had not expected treachery. He believed the republics should have pursued a negotiated transformation rather than a sudden erasure of the Union. In his view, a smaller democratic federation was still possible. Near the end of his life, he offered his sharpest judgment. The Soviet Union did not collapse because of democracy. It collapsed because of those who feared democracy and those who exploited it for personal power.
The economic truth he admitted too late. For much of his life, Gorbachev resisted fully acknowledging the economic ruin he inherited. He often argued reform would have succeeded given time, pointing to external pressures such as the arms race, falling oil prices, and Western competition. In his final years, he admitted these explanations were incomplete. Privately, he conceded the Soviet economy had been far weaker than he understood when he took office. Entire industries existed only on paper. Agricultural output was routinely falsified. Ministries sustained illusions of productivity to preserve authority. In later reflections, he confessed that the system he tried to repair was structurally condemned. The collapse, he believed, was not inevitable because socialism itself was unworkable, but because the Soviet version had hardened into a rigid apparatus sustained by deception rather than reality. This realization was his most painful admission. He had tried to save something that may already have been beyond saving. The awakening that made reversal impossible. Gorbachev believed that once glasnost began, there was no path backward. He described it as an awakening, millions of people discovering for the first time the ability to speak freely, criticize authority, and imagine alternatives. He argued the real collapse did not occur with treaties or declarations. It occurred internally, when people stopped accepting the version of reality the state had imposed for generations. In his view, this was not a political collapse, but a psychological one. The Soviet Union ceased to exist the moment its citizens realized they no longer wished to live inside its constraints. The truth that ended the Union. In his final reflections, Gorbachev articulated what he believed was the core reason the Soviet Union collapsed. Truth entered the public sphere. Once people learned what had been hidden about disasters, corruption, failures, and deception, the foundations of the state could not endure the weight of honesty. He believed a system built on controlled truth can survive for decades. But once truth is released, it faces only two outcomes: reform or collapse. The Soviet system, he concluded, was incapable of reforming fast enough, and so it collapsed. Truth became both the cure and the catastrophe. The legacy he accepted and the one he rejected. Near the end of his life, Gorbachev understood history had assigned him conflicting legacies. In the West, he was remembered as the leader who helped end the Cold War peacefully. In Russia, many viewed him as the man who presided over the loss of an empire. To historians, he remained a reformer whose vision outpaced the system he inherited. He rejected the claim that he destroyed the Soviet Union. He believed its collapse resulted from institutional rigidity, internal conspiracies, and the ambitions of those who followed him. He maintained that a reformed federation had been possible, though he acknowledged that history would debate whether that path was realistic. What mattered to him in the end was intention, and the hope that history would eventually judge him with nuance.